Okay, so welcome all of you to our lecture today. Today our speaker is Professor Ronald Asch from the University of Freiburg. He graduated and then defended his PhD thesis at the Tübingen University, and among other publications, he is the author of a book, Sacral Kingship Between Disenchantment and Reenchantment, the French and English Monarchies between 1587 and 1688. So, and today, Professor Asch is going to talk about tyranny and theories of resistance in the 16th century. So, Professor Asch, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. On the 2nd of August, 1589, Henry III of France was killed by an assassin's knife. The last Valois had been accused by radical Catholics for years on end of showing too much favor to heretics. But what in their eyes had finally offered the last proof that he was indeed a tyrant was the fact that he had given orders in December 1588 to kill the Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal de Lorraine, the leaders of the militantly Catholic Holy League. Quite a number of pamphlets and tracts were published after Henry's death to justify the tyrannicide. The most famous one was probably Jean Boucher's De Juste Henrici Terzi Abdicatione, a text I shall come back to later. Equally radical and perhaps equally influential was a book entitled De Justa Republicae Christianae in Regis Impius et Hereticus Autoritate by one Guillermus Roseus. The author of this polemical tract is not easy to identify. He may have been William Reynolds, an English priest living in exile in Antwerp, or another English Catholic in exile, perhaps William Gifford, a Benedictine monk. In any case, Henry III is the perfect tyrant for the author, just as bad as Julian the Apostate, Caligula, Heliogabal, or Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse. What is the real mark of a tyrant for Roseus? He's quite clear about this, that a typical tyrant is a ruler who does not respect the authority of the church and tries to impose his will on priests and bishops in spiritual matters. In that sense, Henry VIII of England is the classical tyrant, much more so than Richard III, who in Roseus' eyes presents the mere shadow of a tyrant, vix umbra. What is remarkable is that Roseus does not primarily want the king or prince to submit himself to the Pope, but to the bishops of his own realm. In that sense, Roseus represents the Gallican tendencies among the French Holy League, not the papalist ones. It is less surprising that Roseus puts great emphasis on the distinction between tyrants like Henry III of France and those rulers who are quite unjustly accused of being despots or tyrants, such as Philip II of Spain, who always dealt in the most lenient way with his subjects in the Netherlands, according to the author, or Mary, Queen of Scots. Resistance against such rulers is, of course, illegitimate, whereas true tyrants can and should be opposed and, the last resort, deposed. Even private persons can kill a tyrant when there is no other way out. Ideally, however, resistance should be led by noblemen who have the necessary authority and status. The role model for such leaders are the Maccabees in the Old Testament, and Roseus sees the Guise family uniquely qualified to play this role in contemporary France. All the more so as those members of the House of Lorraine who were priests and bishops would be considered a modern equivalent of the priest-king Melchizedek among the Israelites. However, in the last resort, the church could well survive without any kingdom, being able to manage its affairs without outside interference. Such remarks show that Roseus, whoever he was not just an advocate of a strong right of resistance against tyrants, but highly skeptical about the very institution of monarchy. Like many other writers, both Catholics and Protestants alike, who saw tyranny as a major problem in their own time, and who therefore have often been described as monarcho-machts, ever since William Berkeley coined this term at the end of the 16th century. There can be no doubt that during the second half of the 16th century, and that is the period I will concentrate on in my lecture, the threat of tyranny was a central problem in political debates. And of course, that threat was often defined in religious and confessional terms. At the same time, tyranny was, of course, a dangerous topic to discuss, not only because a ruler whom you attacked as a tyrant might not be best pleased with such outspoken criticism, but also because any theory of tyranny and how to resist it could easily undermine the entire fabric of society. This was one of the reasons many authors did their utmost to limit the right of resistance against tyrants in one way or another. For example, by arguing that merely private persons were never entitled to use force in their attempt to fight political injustice. However, despite such qualifications, the increasingly acrimonious debates about the limits of royal authority served over the decades to weaken and desacralize the institution of monarchy. In particular, in countries like England and France, where anointed kings had always claimed an almost priest-like and sacred status, less so perhaps in countries where powerful estates posed anyway a counterweight to royal rule and where kingship was or had become elective, as in late 16th century Poland, in Hungary, or in Denmark, to give only a few examples. But let's go back to the beginning of any serious debate on tyranny in the confessional age. In 1546, the Schmalkaldic War broke out in the Holy Roman Empire. Late in his reign, Charles V tried to sort out the problems which the conflict between Protestants and supporters of the Roman Church had created within his German realm, while at the same time putting princes who dared to resist his authority in their place. In spring 1547, the emperor in person decisively defeated the army of his opponents in the Battle of Mühlberg in Saxony, though he had only achieved his victory by forging an alliance with the Protestant Duke of Saxony in Dresden. Mühlberg seemed to give Charles a chance to impose his own church settlement on Catholics and Protestants alike, the so-called interim, a half-baked compromise that offered Protestants some faith-saving concessions, such as the Eucharist sub utraque. Most Protestant princes and cities accepted the interim, at least nominally, probably assuming that in the last resort, this would be only a temporary solution. However, a few princes and cities held out, and the most important among the cities was Magdeburg, officially not even an imperial free city, but subject to the authority of the archbishop and the cathedral chapter of Magdeburg. In practice, however, it enjoyed a great deal of autonomy. Because of its resistance, Charles V imposed the imperial ban on the citizens and outlawed both the magistrate and the inhabitants. Maurice, Duke and now Elector of Saxony, was asked to crush all resistance by military means, and he did in fact decide to besiege the rebellious city. This moment of crisis, in 1550, the Protestant ministers of Magdeburg issued a manifesto, both in German and in Latin, the so-called Confessio Magdeburgensis, which was to legitimate the city's resistance against both the emperor and his allies. Research over the last decades has tried to show that the Magdeburg Confession had a considerable impact on discussions about the right of resistance all over Europe among Protestants, including Calvinists. In particular, it was the notion that the so-called inferior magistrates had a duty to punish evil just as much as the highest magistrate, and therefore also a right to resist evil in case the higher authority had become tyrannical, which became a rapidly popular theory. And also, like John Knox in Scotland, was certainly familiar with the Magdeburg Confessio. However, other historians have argued that the impact of the Confessio was more limited and that Reformed resistance theory was more strongly influenced by theologians from Switzerland or southwestern Germany, such as Martin Bucer. Even if that were true, the Confessio is a remarkable document because it shows that Lutherans who allegedly preferred passive resistance to violent conflict when confronted with tyranny were quite capable of developing radical ideas as well. For the theologians who had signed the Confessio, the decisive argument was that a ruler who tried to suppress the true church was, in the last resort, the devil's ally, not properly human any longer, but a monster. Such a tyrant had to be fought by all means, and by inferior magistrates just as much as by higher powers. In fact, a later pamphlet defending Magdeburg's position even argued that the emperor himself, by siding with the Pope, the embodiment of Antichrist, had become a merely private person. The confession itself had argued that despite the fact that God's kingdom was not of this world, it was legitimate to defend the true faith, as God had shared his right to punish evildoers with all properly constituted magistrates. And although it was true that Christians should be prepared to suffer for their faith as martyrs, this did not imply that they could not resort to arms to defend themselves against the tyrant. After all, Christians were also allowed to use medicine when they were ill to alleviate their pain or to recover their health. Of course, such principles could only be resorted to in extreme cases. On no account should the common man, Hans Unvernunft, John Lack-Reason, feel entitled to undermine the established political and social order by appealing to a right of resistance. But then the authors of the Magdeburg Confessio saw the troubles the city was facing in an eschatological perspective. The ultimate battle between Antichrist and the true church was at hand. And under such extreme pressure, means to defend the church, which otherwise might have been illegitimate, were permissible. In the end, however, Magdeburg had to make concessions to Maurice of Saxony, who besieged the city. But when this happened in 1551, the Prince-Elector was already about to change sides. This happened. Moritz joined the revolt of the princes against the emperor, whose authority collapsed totally within a very short time, and who decided to abdicate in favor of his brother Ferdinand. Ferdinand signed the compromise peace of Passau with the Protestants in 1552, which gave Lutherans a secure status within the empire, so that most theologians and legal scholars saw no great need to develop theories justifying resistance any further. Radical theories of resistance, like those put forward by the Magdeburg Confession, were not limited to Germany in the mid-16th century. The reign of Mary Tudor in England, 1553 to 1558, who actively persecuted Protestants unwilling to conform to a Catholic Church settlement, forced a number of Reformed theologians into exile. From the comparative safety of their churches in exile, they raged against the Tudor queen as a bloody tyrant. A prominent element in the accusations was the charge of idolatry. Mary did not only suppress the true faith, she promoted the cult of idols. In the eyes of Reformed Protestants, not just the veneration of saints, but the celebration of Mass itself constituted an act of idolatry. As men and women guilty of idolatry had been slaughtered in the times of the Old Testament, it was only just to do the same now. That at least was the opinion of theologians such as Christopher Goodman, one of the Marian exiles and the author in 1558 of a tract entitled How Superior Powers Ought to be Obeyed. Because the Queen herself was the idolater-in-chief, Goodman was convinced that tyrannicide in such a case was legitimate. Such extreme positions, however, soon came to be seen as embarrassing by English Protestants once Protestants had become the official state religion again after 1558. Or as Archbishop Parker put it in 1559, if such principles be spread into men's heads as now they be framed, and referred to the judgment of the subject, to discuss what is tyranny, and to discern whether his prince, his landlord, his master is a tyrant, by his own fancy and collection supposed. What lord of the council shall ride quietly minded in the streets among desperate beasts? What minister shall be sure in his bed chamber? This was to be the perennial problem of concepts of tyranny and theories of resistance. How did you prevent your opponents or the common man to employ them against yourself or the political and ecclesiastical order you wanted to defend? Even if theoretically your resistance theories only undermined the authority of bad rulers, real tyrants who waged war against God's word. They had a pronounced tendency to desacralize monarchy in all its forms. They left at the end of the day not that much place for the godly ruler whose word could not be questioned. This was true not only for England, but even more so for Scotland. Here the Reformation had not been imposed on the country from above, but had been established without and even against the crown in the 1550s. When Scotland's Catholic Queen Mary Stuart returned in 1560 from France to the country where she had been born after the death of her husband Francis II of France, tensions between the Queen and the Protestant subjects were difficult to conceal. The more militant Protestant clergymen, led by the aggressive John Knox, were vehemently opposed to the celebration of the Mass, even in the Queen's private chapel. After all, idolatry remained idolatry, even when committed by a queen in her own palace. In a famous encounter with the Queen's secretary, William Maitland, at the General Assembly of the Kirk in 1564, Knox expounded his view of God's law and how true Christians were obliged to resist a ruler who was a heathen or idolatrous, in particular in a country that had in the past subscribed to a true covenant with God, as Israel had done in times of the Old Testament. In a non-covenanted nation, matters might be different, but not so in Scotland. Knox had argued that in ancient Israel, God's prophets and priests had frequently led uprisings against the king or queen who had promoted idolatry and had seen to it that such pagans were punished and killed. Maitland, however, had a counter-argument. They that withstood the king in the times of the Old Testament were not simple subjects, but were the priests of the Lord, in figure of Christ. And such priests have we none this day to withstand kings if they do wrong. But Knox soon found a suitable answer to the argument. Whereas you say that we have no such priests this day, I might answer that neither have we such kings this day, as then were anointed at God's commandment and set upon the seat of David, and were no less the figure of Christ Jesus in their just administration than were the priests in their appointed office. And such kings, I'm assured, we have not now more than we have such priests. For Christ Jesus, being anointed in our nature of God his Father, both king, priest, and prophet, has put an end to all eternal unction. Thus kings and queens could be resisted and even deposed, because after the incarnation and Christ's passion, kingship had become a merely secular institution without any special sacral authority. In the last resort, Christ's rule over the church and the world as the only true king had undermined monarchy as an institution. This was, of course, an argument so radical that it was unlikely to have much appeal among people outside the circle of militant Protestants. And the same held true, more or less, for the resistance theories promoted by the Marian exiles. For Knox, that may not have been much of a problem, as Mary Stuart could not rely on a powerful Catholic faction in her own country. But for Protestant minorities like the Huguenots in France, or even the Protestants in the Spanish Netherlands, the situation was different. They had to find arguments which could appeal to moderate Catholics, to the politique, and to all those who might object to arbitrary rule, but did not share the ideals of militant Calvinism because they were undecided or indifferent in confessional matters. The situation in France was particularly urgent in this respect. Even before the Night of St. Bartholomew, who in 1572, probably no more than about 10% of all Frenchmen and women were Huguenots, a small minority, although among the nobility there was a higher share of Protestants, perhaps up to 30%, and among the urban population. Nevertheless, the Huguenots remained a minority that could only survive if they found allies, both in France and outside. One needed a concept of tyranny, but also of freedom that appealed to moderate Catholics or discontented noblemen. Nevertheless, initially, there were a number of Protestants who called for full-scale religious war after the Night of St. Bartholomew, like the author of the famous Vindicte contra Tyrannos, published in 1579. The Vindicte asked, I'm quoting from an English translation of the 1640s, now if to bear arms and to make war be a thing lawful, can there possibly be found any war more just than that which is taken in hand by the command of the superior for the defense of the church and the preservation of the faithful? Is there any greater tyranny than that which is exercised over the soul? Can there be imagined a war more commendable than that which suppresses such a tyranny? And he also continued, although then that a church be not increased by arms, notwithstanding it may be justly preserved by the means of arms. I say further that those that die in so holy a war are no less the martyrs of Jesus Christ than their brethren, which were put to death for religion. Nay, they which die in that war seem to have this advantage, that with a free will and knowing sufficiently the hazard into which they cast themselves, notwithstanding, do courageously expose their lives to death and danger. What is remarkable here is the tendency to redefine the notion of martyrdom, which we can observe more widely in this period. Whereas in the Christian tradition, the martyr was predominantly the innocent victim of violence, now the martyr was redefined as a man, or possibly even a woman, who died in a legitimate battle for the true faith, much more a heroic warrior than a mere victim. We see the same tendency among Catholics, perhaps in an even stronger form, as the Catholic Church did of course venerate saints in the traditional way. From the perspective of militant Catholics, even an assassin who killed a tyrant and died in the act of doing so, or who was subsequently executed, could be seen as a true saint, although Rome never officially supported such extreme positions. But that, on the other hand, this cult of warriors or assassins as martyrs might be helpful in strengthening the resolve of one's own followers. But it could hardly appeal to those who hesitated to take sides and who were shocked and appalled by the mounting religious fanaticism. If one wanted to win over the neutrals, it might be much more advisable to hide one's religious fervor and to present the battle one was waging not as a religious war, but as an attempt to safeguard the fundamental laws of one's country and traditional liberties and privileges. Dissimulation as a ploy designed to hide one's true motivation was therefore in the religious conflicts of the 16th century often the order of the day. Finding arguments which might appeal to moderates from the other side was a central preoccupation in debates on tyranny and resistance in the later 16th century. In France, it was a legal scholar, François Audemars, who provided some of the most plausible and influential answers to this challenge in his famous Franco-Gallia, published in 1573, but probably written to a large extent before the Night of St. Bartholomew. Audemars tried to construct a history of the French Constitution that emphasized its republican elements and the roots present-day France had in the ancient liberty which the Frankish warriors who had once conquered the country had cherished so much. Kingship, according to Audemars, had originally been elective, and the king could only rule the country with the consent of his council. This ancient liberty had to a considerable extent been lost, but it still presented the ideal one should strive for. Audemars' historical interpretation could well be used to give the Estates General a special political role. But the provincial assemblies of the Huguenots could also claim a special role as defenders of this ancient liberty. What was perhaps even more important was the argument that French liberty was threatened by strangers, by forces that were alien to French political culture. For Ottoman, whose own family was of German origin, it were wily Italians, like the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medicis, who was widely seen as responsible for the murder of so many Protestants in 1572, but also the power-hungry Spaniards who tried to destroy French liberty. This discourse of patriotism became ever more important after 1584, in the last phase of the Wars of Religion, when Henry of Navarre, the leader of the Huguenots, emerged as the heir presumptive of the French crown. To combine the appeal to a genuine or invented constitutional tradition with the claim that any real patriotism had to be based on such traditions was a widespread strategy at the time. In fact, we find this argument just as much as in France in George Buchanan's De Jure Regni Apud Scotus, published in 1579. Buchanan emphasized the contractual relationship between the king and his subjects, and the latter were in fact never mere subjects, but citizens with a clear right and duty to participate in the politics of the Commonwealth and, if needs be, to end the rule of a tyrant by armed resistance. Buchanan's arguments were not primarily of a historical nature. They were based much more on notions of natural law and on the republican ideals of ancient Roman Greece. Nevertheless, Buchanan did write a detailed history of his own country, which was meant to underpin his particular vision of a monarchy limited by the rule of law. Such an approach was increasingly popular in the late 16th century. When the Netherlands revolted against Philip II of Spain, they based their resistance against the Spanish tyrant not so much on natural law, but on the ancient privileges the estates of the various duchies and counties had enjoyed. Such arguments were at first not developed in any systematic way. That was left to a time when the Dutch Republic could be fairly certain to survive, having beaten off the Spanish onslaught. But it is significant that in the early 17th century, attempts were made to find the roots of Dutch liberty in Roman antiquity. Grotius' Liber de Antiquitate Republicae Batavicae, first published in 1610, was such an attempt to construct a historical foundation for the new Dutch Republic and to argue that in the Netherlands, a very specific tradition of free institutions had always existed, even in Roman or pre-Roman times. Such works, trying to appeal to history and the battle against oppression and tyranny, are typical for an age when constitutional history was flourishing and legal antiquarianism became a dominant discipline among scholars. For legal humanists in the late 16th century, or at least the Protestants among them, the defense of freedom and true patriotism became increasingly one and the same. And this was true not just for France, the Dutch Republic, and Scotland, but also for the Holy Roman Empire. In Germany, the situation was different from the one in France. The Peace of Augsburg had given Protestants a reasonable amount of security in 1552. So while radical Protestants had been tempted during and immediately after the War of Schmalkalden to depict the emperor as a tyrant, such an approach became almost inconceivable, at least for Lutherans, after 1555. On the contrary, Protestants now once more took pride in the fact that the Germans as a nation could claim the imperial dignity, which in its scope and authority was constructed very much in a national sense now. The old conflicts between Pope and Emperor were now interpreted from a Protestant perspective, and even Charles V could be seen as the Pope's adversary, and therefore in retrospect as a potential defender of German freedom. The real enemy of German liberty was not the Emperor, but the Pope, and second to the Pope, the King of Spain. Tyranny was therefore defined as something alien to the German constitutional tradition, a threat from outside, not something potentially inherent in the constitutional system itself. Such arguments were, of course, designed to persuade the Catholic princes of the empire who did indeed often mistrust the Spanish monarchy, that they were well advised to seek a compromise with Protestants and to preserve the Deutsche Libertät, German liberty. However, in the last resort, this sort of Reichspatriotismus, patriotism focused on the empire, was never fully shared by Catholics before 1648. Their political allegiance was defined by loyalty towards the emperor as a person, not so much by identifying with specific constitutional traditions or with Germany as a patria. But undoubtedly, the language of patriotism and of an ancient constitution was less subversive than any attempt to depict a legitimate ruler as a potential tyrant. The discourse of patriotism, at least in the German case, was therefore more about preventing any possible subversion of well-established constitutional rights in the future than about actually resisting an authority that had become tyrannical. This was to change after 1618 to a certain extent, but even then many Lutherans tried to reject imperial policies while remaining loyal to the emperor as a person. We can observe similar changes in England after 1560. Whereas the Marian exiles had to some extent espoused quite radical ideas when it came to defining tyranny and how to resist a tyrant, such arguments were soon downplayed once Protestantism became the religion by law established again. Writers and theologians loyal to the new regime emphasized, and that of course was a traditional position, a sort of commonplace among most theologians of whatever persuasion, that political dominion was not founded in grace but in nature. But of course, this did not mean that one had forgotten what had happened in the 1550s entirely. One was only too well aware that a legitimate ruler could suddenly turn against the Church of England, as Queen Mary had done in the 1550s. When Elizabethan lawyers laid so much emphasis on the specific merits of the ancient constitution and on the liberties Magna Carta had granted to English subjects, such arguments were also designed to make any repeat performance of Mary Tudor's reign less likely. As Sir John Baker, in his study, The Reinvention of Magna Carta, has shown, the Great Charter had been almost forgotten in the late Middle Ages and the early 16th century. The fact that it became ever more important for English legal thought from the Elizabethan age onwards was due in part to the attempt to show that specific traditions which created a national system of legal safeguards and liberties enjoyed their own legitimacy as opposed to the universal claims of canon law promoted by the papacy. But Magna Carta was also to serve as a safeguard against any kind of clericalism, and be it the clericalism of Protestant bishops. If England was a monarchy, there was a clear tendency in the late 16th century to define it as a monarchical republic, a monarchy where the Queen ruled subjects who could very well claim the rights and status of citizens, at least insofar as they belonged to the social and political elite. Such a discourse became particularly important in the 1580s, when it had become clear that Elizabeth I would die one day without a direct heir, as she was childless, and when Mary, Queen of Scots, might therefore claim the vacant English throne. The bond of association promoted in 1584 by Lord Burleigh and Francis Walsingham, the Queen's secretary, was designed to forestall such an event, in particular if the Queen were to be killed by an assassin. Although the bond was meant to defend the ruling Queen, it would have transformed England for all intents and purposes into an elective monarchy, should it ever have become the basis of direct political action. This was not the case, as Elizabeth died a natural death in 1603, while her rival Mary Stuart had been executed in 1587. but the challenge of making sure that a possible tyrant did not even have the chance to claim the crown was not specific to England in the 1580s, far from it. The problem was perhaps, at least from a Catholic perspective, an even more pressing one in France. With the death of the Duke of Anjou in 1584, the Protestant Henry of Navarre had become the heir presumptive of the French crown. From a Catholic point of view, that was completely unacceptable and had to be prevented. Writers who supported the cause of the Holy League did not hesitate to point out that once Henry became king, Catholics would be persecuted in France as brutally as they were in England. The suffering of martyrs, publicized in France in word and image, thus fueled the religious and political passions of militant Catholics. For the supporters of the Holy League, it was important to show that the rule of Protestants in France was inconceivable. In fact, they pointed out that the Huguenots themselves could not claim to be really French, for to be truly French, one had to be a Catholic. This was all the more true for the king. No Protestants could possibly become king, as the principal form, the glory and the ceremonial solemnities of this kingdom, of the kingdom's offices and acts, consisted in rituals which were religious in nature, as Louis d'Orléans, one of the more vociferous writers supporting the League, pointed out. Moreover, no man could truly become king without being anointed. And how could a Protestant who rejected the celebration of Mass be anointed? For militant Catholics, a Protestant claiming the crown was therefore, by definition, a tyrant. Matters came to a head when Elizabeth I, that Mary Queen of Scots, executed after all she had been a former French queen consort. The Guise and their followers argued that this execution was not only the act of a tyrant, but that the French king, the last Valois, had somehow connived in this regicide. In Paris, the fury of Catholics boiled over. Barricades were erected, and Henry III could consider himself lucky that he could escape in disguise to Blois. His order to kill the Duke of Guise, mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, was his personal answer to the riots in Paris. The Duke had been foolhardy enough to attend the royal court in Blois. But such a deed provoked, of course, further violence. While the Pope confronted the king with an ultimatum to do penance for the murder of the Duke of Guise's brother, a cardinal, the Sorbonne declared Henry III excommunicated outright. Admittedly, the sentence of the Sorbonne was valid only doctrinaliter, giving advice to the faithful in matters of conscience, not judicialiter. But in political terms, this did not make much of a difference. For the theologians of the Sorbonne, but also for many supporters of the League, Paris, in its struggle against heresy, had become the new Jerusalem, a sacred city, and the French nation had become God's new chosen people, the people of Israel, whereas Henry de Valois was the Pharaoh who oppressed him. Although the sacred character of kingship as an institution was not denied as such, Henry de Valois or Henry de Navarre had no legitimate claim to exercise such sacred authority. While the institutions representing the nation, the Parlement of Paris, the Estates General, and the French bishops, could act in the name of a divine mandate granted to them by God. Huguenots, on their part, in the early phase of the wars of religion, had already shown a strong tendency to desacralize the monarchy. Royal tombs had been destroyed, and the royal coats of arms removed from churches. To some extent, this was part of the general wave of iconoclasm, purging churches of the signs of idolatry. But clearly, the institution of monarchy itself was seen as potentially tyrannical. Nevertheless, regicide had never been openly advocated by Protestant writers. One was far too cautious to do that. Catholics, however, were less cautious, but they were still reluctant in 1588 or 1589 to call Henry de Valois a tyrant who had to be assassinated. But after the death of the Guise brothers, the king was increasingly treated in public discourse as merely a private person. a man who had forfeited his claim to the crown. And once he had been killed, the man who killed the king was indeed openly celebrated as a hero. In August 1589, a monk named Jacques Clément, under the influence of the many sermons that depicted the king as a monster, assassinated and killed the last Valois ruler. Clément, who died in the act himself, was soon celebrated as a saint-like figure in Paris, a hero and a martyr. Some eulogies even compared Clément to Christ. While Christ had sacrificed his life to save mankind from sin, Clément had died to defend both true religion and public liberty. This ambivalence about the veneration of Clément was typical. He could be seen as the righteous defender of an essentially theocratic order, but also as a man who died for republican ideals of liberty. Such ideals were embedded in a deeply religious outlook, which, however, was shaped more by Gallican traditions than by support for the supreme authority of the Pope in political matters. Cornel Zwierlein has pointed out these inconsistencies recently. Such Gallican tendencies, which might lead to a full-scale rejection of the Pope as supreme judge, were observed with a certain amount of nervousness at the Curia. Nevertheless, the Pope himself was reported as having remarked after the murder of Henry III that the death of the French tyrant was a true miracle, not unlike the incarnation, and that in such a miraculous event one could recognize the workings of divine providence. In Paris, processions were held to persuade the Pope to declare Clément a saint. Had the Guise and the League succeeded after 1589 in preventing Henry de Navarre's succession to the crown, Clément would have become the foundational hero of a new Catholic state, a monarchy that respected the rights and privileges of the Catholic aristocracy as much as those of cities, corporations, and provincial estates. The veneration in which Clément as a regicide was held for a couple of years was in many ways peculiar to the political culture of militant Catholicism, although Protestant and in particular Calvinist writers also advocated a right of resistance. The actual killing of a crowned and anointed ruler was hardly ever openly supported at this point in time. However, in the 1590s, for Catholics celebrating Clément's deed, transforming him into a saint-like hero was one way to justify the regicide. In a more systematic way, League theologians tried to achieve similar objectives. The most influential of these anti-royalist tracts was probably Jean Boucher's De Justa Henrici Tertii Abdicatione. Like Huguenot writers before him, though relying on different sources, Boucher argued that monarchy was contractual in nature. Omnino rex nemo nascitur. Nobody is ever born as a king. To really become a legitimate ruler, a pretender or an heir needed to be anointed and crowned, and that implied that he was accepted by the community of the realm, by bishops, peers, and the estates general. While priests and bishops derived their status and authority directly from God, this was not the case with secular ruler. Monarchy remained a human institution, and it was therefore legitimate to resist a ruler who promoted heresy. The problem for the League, however, was that it had no truly credible candidate for the royal succession. The League was therefore left with the choice of either promoting a woman as successor to Henry III, which would have been a break with the Salic law, or to support the claims of a member of the House of Lorraine, essentially a foreign prince to the crown. For those who supported Henry de Navarre's candidacy, it was therefore an obvious strategy to emphasize that no good Frenchman, no bon français, could ever swear allegiance to a foreigner, and that the Leaguers were about to betray their country. Thus, the language of patriotism, which in the past had supplied arguments in favor of a monarchy limited by privileges, could now be employed to defeat those who tried to argue that religious allegiance trumped national identity. For militant Catholics, however, a faithful member of the Universal Church was first and foremost a citizen of the Civitas Dei, not of an earthly commonwealth. And as Sophie Nichols has put it in a recent study of the League's political thought, for the League, no Catholic could ever be considered a foreigner to a Catholic community. For militant Catholics, the patrie was a universal Christian community within which individual political communities were embedded. But this idea of patriotism was not easy to sell in a country where so much political intellectual capital had been invested in the idea that this particular kingdom was somehow special within the Universal Church. Once Henry IV had converted to Catholicism in 1593, the League authors were increasingly playing a losing game. However, the diehards among them, like Jean Boucher, were reluctant to admit that. In their opinion, the royalist catchword, Je suis bon français, was just a pretense to justify a war against God's church. According to Boucher, who preached a number of sermons focusing on Henry IV's pretended conversion to Catholicism, the royalists should take care that the notion of bon français became not devalued in the same way in which the concept of politique or the idea of belonging to the gens d'honneur had lost their original meaning and had become bywords just for self-serving opportunism. However, the majority of Catholics who had once violently opposed the Protestant succession made their peace with the newly converted king, who was duly crowned in 1594. For Henry IV and the royalists, it was now of the utmost importance to demonstrate that the king's authority was truly sacred, that no religious opposition could challenge his authority. And in that way, the monarchy was re-sacralized. French historians have emphasized that during Henry's reign, monarchy was transformed. Religious devotion was transferred from the church and her saints to the king. For many clergymen, even some of those who had in the past supported the League, rebelliousness and disobedience now became a sort of heresy and an attack on the anointed ruler, a sacrilege. But this new model of monarchy, which precluded the use of any discourse which depicted the prince as a potential tyrant, in turn imposed new constraints on the ruler. In the last resort, the League, although defeated in its attempt to prevent Henry's succession, had been successful in establishing a new fundamental law in France. The king had to be a Catholic and had to demonstrate his allegiance to the church and his piety in governing the country. Certainly, after the death of Henry IV by an assassin's knife in 1610, it became ever more problematic in France to openly discuss the constitutional limits of monarchy. But then, of course, the appeal to a right of resistance was used not just by unruly noblemen or mere subjects who thought that their king or prince was a heretic or in other ways a tyrant, but also by foreign powers that sought a justification for intervening in the affairs of a neighboring country. Of course, notions of sovereignty were in general still much vaguer in the 16th century than after 1648. It was not unusual for a great nobleman to be a royal liegeman and subject and still pursuing independently his objectives on the European stage. And this held true even for France, not just for the Holy Roman Emperor. But these foreign powers, it came natural to such princes to seek alliances with foreign powers. But these foreign powers themselves also defined their status, prestige, and authority by the willingness and ability to protect clients outside the borders of their own dominions. This was quite clearly the case with the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Empire was sustained and owed its coherence to a missionary ideology. More than any other prince, the King of Spain was expected to spread the message of the true faith in Europe and in the New World, and to defend those who suffered for their allegiance to Rome. For Protestant rulers, and of course none of them was as powerful as the King of Spain, the challenges were of a different kind. Most Protestant theologians insisted that politics and religion should be kept separate when it came to questions of obedience. The gospel could and should not be spread by force of arms, and the mere fact that another ruler did not support the true church was no reason to declare war on him. But what about rulers who persecuted their own subjects because they did not want to renounce the gospel? Was it legitimate to support such subjects by force of arms? This was a subject which one of the most important Protestant legal scholars of the late 16th century, Alberico Gentili, who held the chair of civil law in Oxford, discussed at length in his important De Jure Belli Commentationes in 1589. On the one hand, Gentili emphasized that no prince should exploit mere religious tensions in a neighboring country to stir up trouble there and incite subjects to rise up against their natural ruler. A king had no right to examine and judge the actions of another sovereign in domestic affairs. Matters were different, however, when a rebellion had already broken out, as in France after 1562 or in the Netherlands. In such a case, it could well be legitimate to intervene in an existing conflict, not so much out of a feeling of religious solidarity, but because a ruler who behaved like a tyrant posed a threat to his neighbors, as well as to those who owed him allegiance. Neque licet cum suis facere quod metuendum alies est. It was not permissible to treat one's own subjects so savagely that others had reason to fear that they might be treated in the same way in the future. Moreover, if a sufficiently brutal ruler crushed the rebellion, there was always a danger that he would destroy the traditional constitution of the country he ruled and the balance of power this constitution had sustained. This in itself should pose a danger to neighboring countries that now faced beyond their borders a people totally different from the one they were accustomed to. The fear that such radical changes would undermine any peaceful arrangements between states in itself justified interventions in a civil war, a sort of preemptive war to preserve the existing equilibrium of power. In the last resort, every sovereign had to decide himself what posed a danger to his safety, and nobody could tell him that his fears were illegitimate. Non prescribendum quoquis metuat. No one can lay down rules for what somebody should fear. That was quite a radical approach, which Gentili, of course, took to justify English intervention in the Netherlands. But his reflections in the Jure Belli show that tyranny, or was perceived as tyranny, was a problem not just for domestic politics, but also for relations between the various European dynasties. Let me, at the end of my lecture, say a few words about the legacy the debates on tyranny and the right of resistance left for the following decades. This legacy was ambivalent. If you look at France, the wars of religion and the violent deaths of two successive kings within a fairly short time created a lasting trauma. The quest for stability now became paramount. This did not mean that France ceased to experience noble rebellions and civil unrest after 1610, but those who participated in these confrontations saw to it that the stakes remained much lower than during the wars of religion. The person of the king was hardly ever directly attacked. Criticism focused on his favorites and ministers. Pamphlets printed during the Fronde, for example, in the late 1640s and early 1650s, could be violent enough, but Republican ideas were largely absent, with the possible exception of the Armée in Bordeaux. In fact, the fundamental discussions of the nature of the French Constitution, which had marked the late 16th century, were now avoided. The feeling was now widespread that such topics were so explosive that they were best left alone. Of course, after 1660, with royal authority reasserted, every everybody knew that would not be a good idea to question the king's authority if one did not want to end up in banishment in the far away provincial town or castle. Only after 1715, constitutional debates revived, not just under the influence of the Enlightenment, but also in the context of the Jansenist controversy. England, however, offers a different picture. Here, the resistance theories of the 16th century, though domesticated in official discourse, were never entirely forgotten. And with the deepening conflict between Crown and Parliament, they came into their own again. And when Parliament needed arguments to fight the king in the Civil War and subsequently bringing him to trial as a tyrant, it was not just the Protestant traditions of political theory they relied on. At least indirectly, the Catholic theories of resistance had some influence on their actions and rhetoric as well. But that would be a topic for another lecture. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Asch, for this very interesting panorama of ideas and arguments and figures and historical events in France and Germany and England. It's my first impression is a great diversity of arguments and approaches to the problem of tyranny and tyrannicide and resistance. I don't know if that would be a fair impression or.
Well, I mean, you face conflicts of a totally different nature. I mean, if you look at England or the Holy Roman Empire, the position of Protestants is either seemingly quite secure as in England, or at least they enjoy some guarantees as in the Holy Roman Empire. But it's important that in the Holy Roman Empire, Calvinists, whose position was not necessarily covered by the Peace of Augsburg in 1552, because some people argued that they didn't really subscribe to the Confessio Augustana of 1530. So they were outside this piece of religion. Calvinists favored more strongly active resistance, at least as a potential move in political conflicts than the Lutherans, who thought, well, we've got the law on our side, and in the end, we will always find an arrangement with the emperor. So there are differences there. Whereas in France, of course, the Huguenots are a small minority who before 1598, and even then it was very precarious, could never achieve real toleration. So, I mean, they need some sort of theory to justify even quite radical resistance.
I see. We have a question from Edmund Stewart. Do you feel tyranny in this period should be defined more as a rule contrary to the constitution, or rule by a ruler who lacked just title as a usurper, or were both views possible?
Well, this distinction is, of course, the traditional medieval one. You have the tyrant absque titulo, and the tyrant who is a tyrant because he exercises legitimate power in a way which is not legitimate. You find both arguments, but of course they become mixed when you have a succession crisis. The debate in France from 1584 onwards, when the last Catholic heir of Henry III, the Duke of Anjou, dies, is that you might get a new ruler who is a Protestant, and from a Catholic perspective, a Protestant is bound to be seen as a tyrant because he would be likely to persecute Catholics. But they also argue that a Protestant, by definition, can have no real claim to the crown, really. He can't be properly anointed, because the anointing has to take place in a Catholic mass. He can't take part in that, so he can't have a just title either. So these things overlap in a way. But at least for the traditional monarchies, the tyrant who becomes a tyrant because he exercises his power in the wrong way is a more dominating figure than the usurper.
Thank you. We have a question from Mark Greengrass. So can you unmute yourself and possibly turn the camera on? Okay.
Well, hello, and thank you for that.
Hello,
thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for that wonderfully rich and broad-ranging lecture. I'd like to just intervene on 3 points and get your reactions on them, please, very briefly. Firstly, that excellent point that you made about the changing conception of martyrdom, the redefinition of martyrdom. And it's true that Fox almost never uses the word tyranny, but yet for him, it's clear that the martyrdom, as he portrays it, is a kind of ultimate protest in the face of power. He may not call it tyranny, but it is a protest against, and it's a protest that it is interesting in 2 respects. Firstly, it challenges the position of passive obedience, and secondly, it challenges that distinction that you rightly made between lesser magistrates and individuals. Martyrdom is something where it's an individual who is taking the lead, even if it is as a form of ultimate protest. That's the first point I wanted your reactions on. The second point is as regards the Huguenot rights of resistance. What always strikes me is how timid, ultimately, French Protestants were. And it's true that Huckman in Franco-Gallia presents the case for an ancient constitution based upon Merovingian sources. But it was a case that was so easily destroyed by royalist magistrates because the sources were not really terribly rich, and because the legal antiquarianism that you rightly pointed to could always be turned around to make a fairly plausible case, especially when you were dealing with periods of history that were so remote. But there are 2 Hoffmanns. There's the Hoffmann of Franco-Gallia, and then there's the Hoffmann of De Fioribus Gallicis, the outrageous pamphlet against St. Bartholomew, where he presents Catherine de Medicis in particular as this tyrant, but he never really calls her a tyrant. So he presents all the case, but then he pulls away from drawing the conclusions to that argument. And when one looks at the political assemblies of the Protestants in the 1570s, after St. Bartholomew, they always seem to be pulling their punches because ultimately they know that they have to negotiate a peace one way or another with someone that they might call a tyrant. But if they press the case too hard, they're going to damage what's going to be essential to them. So it's not that they're politique so much as they're just faced with a very uncomfortable reality, aren't they? And then finally, as you rightly pointed out, the real tyrannicide that occurs is with the death of Henry III. And what strikes one is the huge impact that has, not just immediately, but over the longer term, especially when it's put alongside the double death of Henry IV too, which perhaps wasn't a tyrannicide, but it was often interpreted as such. It created a kind of hypersensitivity about tyrannicide in France. But that hypersensitivity is partly because of the extreme monarchicalization, which had already begun before 1589, and which, as you pointed out so well in that wonderful book, The Resacralization in France, cements afterwards. So just 3 points then.
Right. Perhaps I'd take up the second point first about Ottoman and the Huguenots. I mean, the Huguenots are essentially not in a very strong position because they are a small minority. And after the Night of St. Bartholomew, which mostly extinguishes Protestant life in northern France, or a lot of it at least. So they are left with their strongholds in the west and the south, but in northern France, their presence has been much diminished. They have to be cautious in many ways. And there's still the hope that somehow a compromise can be achieved with the crown, which of course to some extent is the case in the 1590s. I mean, many may have been disappointed that Henry IV becomes a Catholic, but he did grant them the Edict of Nantes, which was precarious, but still much better than what they had got in the past. So that door is left open, seeking a compromise with the crown, and they have to leave that door open because they're weak. The other point that Ottoman cannot prove his point, I'm not entirely sure that I'm convinced by that, because I mean, you can create all sorts of historical narratives at a time. I mean, look at England and the myths of the ancient constitution. I mean, the idea that there were parliaments or that there was a parliament before 1066, even at the time, was not something that you could easily prove by any records in the Tower anywhere else. But still, it was widely held by people like Sir Edward Coke and others, because it was part of national myths which you needed to sustain a whole legal edifice and political outlook. So, and in Germany, you get this idea of an ancient German liberty going back to the Germans described by Tacitus. So it was a fashion at the time, and I'm not. And of course, there's the argument which I think James Collins has made, that there was something like a republican tradition in France in the 16th century, which however vanished in the 17th century, which was perhaps, which went underground in the 17th century to re-emerge perhaps in the 18th century. So I'm not quite sure about that. The death of Henry III. Interesting point is, I think, that Henry III doesn't get a royal funeral when he's killed. I think you've pointed that out yourself, actually. And only when Henry IV is killed in 1610, I think the coffin of Henry III is transferred to Saint-Denis. So he gets a royal funeral after all. So there is, I think, a widespread sort of bad feeling about Henry III and the late stage of the Valois. His murder may still have been seen as shocking, but it's not such an easy task to give back cultural and social and religious capital to the monarchy. It's a long-term struggle, and perhaps it is the trauma of 1610, of the murder of Henry IV, which has much less public support, I think, than the murder of Henry III, which makes it easier to re-sacralize monarchy then. And of course, Louis XIII is a fully paid up Catholic and so on. There's no doubt about his Catholic piety and so on. All right, he's got Richelieu as a minister, but even Richelieu is a bishop. So it's a long-term process to re-sacralize the monarchy. The first point about the martyrdom, I think that it's in a more pronounced way. There's a general tendency both among Protestants and among Catholics to redefine martyrdom and to see people who actually use violence and force of arms themselves against their enemies all the same as martyrs when they are killed in action, or when they are assassinated or executed or anything like that. But still, I would say that Jacques Clément, who is a sort of suicide assassin, almost a suicide killer, and he's really venerated as a saint, unofficially, of course. He isn't declared a saint by Rome, but for a short time in Paris, he's venerated as a saint. And I think on the Catholic side, this tendency for a certain period of time is more pronounced to say somebody can fight and be active. And that changes maybe during the course of the 17th century. I mean, the point has been made that in the early 17th century, the notion of sainthood changes again, and that now suffering and having visions and caring for the sick and the weak become important again as notions of sainthood. And sainthood may even become, to a certain extent, feminized after the end of the wars of religion. You get people like Madame d'Acquary and others who embody this new ideal of sainthood, which is much less violent, which may still embody a sort of militant piety, but it's not the militant piety of the battlefield. But that's a long-term transformation.
Thank you. I can see a question coming from Ken. I'm sorry, I can't see your last name. Would you like to ask a question yourself, or I can also read it from the chat box?
Do you feel
yeah, is it like
the political conceptualization
of tyranny in this period?
Any form of one man? There wasn't, I mean, there is little sort of principled republicanism, which would declare monarchy itself as tyrannical in nature. You do find that from the 1640s onwards in the English Civil War, and of course in the trial of Charles I in 1649, when there's a tendency to say, if we look at the Bible, the Old Testament, kingship hasn't got a very good reputation there. The direct rule of God is far more important than, or is not easily compatible with venerating the rule of a merely human being as king or queen. So you've got that tendency in the 17th century, and you've got even allusions to Nimrod, a biblical figure, as the quintessential monarch who essentially then is a tyrant. But I can't see that very much in the late 16th century. Even the militant Catholics, who are so aggressive towards Henry III and to a lesser extent Henry IV, don't reject monarchy as such. That isn't really the case. So I can't really see that much of that much of a strong Republican tradition. I mean, I suppose a disciple of Quentin Skinner might see these matters slightly differently, but I can't see this in this period that much. Right. Certainly not in France or England or Germany.
Okay. And there is a comment and a question from Professor Karin Ederman. Professor Ederman, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Or I can read it. John of Salisbury.
I'll read it. So John of Salisbury, of course, famously defended a conception of tyrannicide, and this was invoked by Jean Petit to justify the murder of the Duke of Orleans in 1407. Do you find any echoes of John's theory from the Polycraticus during the period that you examined? Certainly, there were many manuscripts of the work spread throughout Europe.
I'm not aware of this myself. There may have been some reference in Boucher's writings or other writings of the Catholic League, and they were certainly aware of the late medieval tradition. Of course, one shouldn't forget that Catholic authors in the late 16th century had a sort of advantage when they wanted to justify resistance against the tyrant, they could say the Pope has deposed and excommunicated this man, so action against such a ruler, so he's now a private person, and an action against this private person is legitimate. I mean, if you take Henry III, there had been this papal ultimatum, which Henry III didn't answer, which indirectly deposed him, and the Sorbonne had declared him to be excommunicate. So this was easier than when you then taking action against somebody who hadn't encountered that sort of papal sentence.
I have a question, if I may. You interestingly pointed out how the arguments were made for the sort of barbaric origins of freedom, in the sense of the Merovingian or the Frankish kingdom and the pre-1066 England, and the same with Germany, with the Tacitus's description of the Germans. So it's it's interesting attempt to locate the sources of freedom sort of outside the Roman Empire and Christianity in some respect, I think. And also you mentioned a couple of arguments pertaining the Bible and the Christian tradition. So what about the classical Greco-Roman repertoire of ideas about tyranny and tyrannicide? Were they invoked often, or how you see their place in the overall picture?
Somebody like Buchanan, who is a great humanist, is certainly very familiar with this ideal of Roman freedom. And his arguments are based on that. As far as tyrannicide is concerned, I think these classical examples may be less important than a language of political thought based on the Bible or on a real or imagined historical antiquity. Well, you could have, I mean, if you go back to Roman history, if you go to the early times, you've got Brutus, of course, as a figure. Well, I mean, he does appear in these series of resistance. But then traditionally, at least the rule of the early emperors, or at least of Augustus, was not seen as totally evil in the Christian tradition. I mean, the later emperors may have been different. So you can have a sort of classical republicanism, which emphasizes that the subjects of a monarch also enjoy the rights and the duties of citizens, without that necessarily being linked to the idea of tyrannicide or a right of resistance, which may be based on different arguments. But I would say that overall, biblical arguments or arguments based on history are more important properly. Because as I mentioned earlier, you've got few writers, few theorists who would really say monarchy in itself is evil. Even, I mean, the Dutch who rise up against Philip of Spain don't argue that monarchy in itself is evil. I mean, if you take the Wilhelmus, the Dutch national anthem to this day, William of Orange says, "I've always been a faithful servant to Philip II. He just didn't respect that, but I've been a faithful servant to Philip II. He didn't respect my rights as a great nobleman," and that sort of thing. So there isn't really, I would say, that much rejection of monarchy as an institution. You would have to move into the 17th century to get that perspective. And I wouldn't say, I mean, Quentin Skinner has made this argument that when people read enough Cicero, or Tacitus for that matter, they become by definition skeptical about monarchy. I'm not so sure that that's really true. I think that's taking matters too far. And also like Tacitus, who is, of course, very influential in the late 16th century, can be read in many different ways. I mean, Tacitus certainly takes a somewhat darkish view of the monarchs or the Roman Caesars of his time, but Tacitus can also be read as a book of advice to rulers, how to rule by deception and by Machiavellian plots. So you can read Tacitus in different ways.
Yes. So, and I think maybe it's helpful to distinguish arguments within the realm of political theory from rhetoric. So I think because of course there is the tradition, the rhetorical tradition of invoking figures such as Nero, for instance, or Caligula as archetypal tyrants, but it has little to do with political theory, because as you say, it's not about whether we should have monarchy or of the republic or parliament or whatever, but it's the personal sort of the generation of the tyrant that it's. But when you mentioned the last years of Henry III reign, it seems that it might have been occasion for such rhetoric. So
you certainly have that. Yes, he's certainly compared to anti-Christian rulers in antiquity. Yes. Yeah.
Another question or comment from Professor Nederman. John of Salisbury read a lot of Cicero, and he was hardly a Republican, but Skinner doesn't consider that. Okay. Okay, yes. And also, I think it's interesting, and maybe you can say something about that, how the very word Republican was understood, because from what I remember in the Middle Ages, res publica was just a term for a political community. It didn't imply any particular constitution or role of parliament or a king or a prince. But does it change much over the 16th and the 17th century?
If you were to define res publica as a political system without a monarchy, you would have to say libera res publica. That would sort of imply, I mean, libera res publica would refer to the ancient Roman Republic before Caesar. That was the libera res publica, and you find that in Tacitus and other authors. But I mean, as colleagues of mine have pointed out, even the Swiss, although they were anti-aristocratic to some extent and only recognized the authority of the emperor in a very, very vague way and didn't want to have any intervention by outside powers, did not really consider themselves in around 1600 as republicans in the modern sense. I mean, their their community was embedded in a wider political system which was dominated by monarchy. And of course, you could go to Italy, where you've got Venice and Genoa and Lucca as the three remaining republics. But even in Venice, you have the Duke, the Doge, who is a sort of elected monarch with limited powers, all right. But you can see that even a genuine republic feels the need to have some sort of monarchical head of state or figurehead or representative, in particular for foreign relations. And of course, you've got that in the Netherlands with the stadtholder, who is a sort of quasi-monarch to a certain extent. So the moment where you get a republic which would really say, we are totally different from this older tradition of an aristocratic, courtly, monarchical world. The first republic like that is probably the English Republic in the 1650s, from 1649 onwards, and that has, I think, a European impact. But before that, it would be quite unusual, I would say.
Thank you very much. And I think on that note, unless there are some other questions, we could wrap up this this meeting. Thank you again, Professor Asch, for your excellent talk, and I want to thank everyone for the questions and the comments and the discussion. And the next lecture will not be on Tuesday, but on Monday. I will send out the information. It will be on Monday, the 18th of December, and not 5 p.m. but 7 p.m. And we will listen to a talk on the 16th century Poland and Lithuania, which might be an interesting context for what you were talking about today. So thank you again, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.